Good afternoon and welcome to the finale of our Faculty Research Masterclass series. I would like to thank all of our faculty participants throughout the semester for sharing just a little bit of their research with us. Included in that list is today's conversation leader, Associate Professor Virginia Eubanks from the Department of Political Science. Before we welcome Professor Eubanks, I have a couple of programmatic notes as usual. First, you are welcome to start posting your questions for today's panel at any point. You can use the chat function, and if you would like for your question to remain anonymous, you can certainly send it directly to me, and I will relay that question to Professor Eubanks. Closed captioning has been enabled for anyone who would like to use it. You can find the transcript either in the chat function or on the bottom of your screen, depending on your version of Zoom. And I also wanted to let everyone know that the entirety of today's discussion will be recorded and shared through the Rockefeller College YouTube channel. And with that, I will turn the digital virtual mic over to Professor Eubanks. Thanks.
Hi, so thanks for your patience as having a little bit of cursor disappearance, but it's back. I'm really excited to be here. I want to welcome everyone who's here to the conversation. I want to start by sort of telling you a little bit about me, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we'll cover today. And then make a plea of sorts before we get started into the real content. So first, I want to just say thank you to Rockefeller College for the invitation to talk about oral history in the digital welfare state. I want to especially thank Kelly Hammond and Renee Wallingford for all of their really hard and often invisible work making these things happen, making sure all of our heads get in these boxes. None of that would happen without their labor and their love. And I also want to thank Dean Julie Novkov for being here to moderate and to be in conversation with me today. Also, I want to thank all of you for taking what is probably your lunch hour to have this conversation about some things that I think are really important, but I know that we all have very busy lives, and particularly a huge number of Zoom commitments in our calendars. And so any extra hour you spend on Zoom is something I really appreciate. So just to talk about what's going to happen today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what oral history is, and we're going to sort of briefly explore a classic of oral history, Studs Terkel's book, Working. We're going to talk briefly after that about the project that I'm engaged in now with Andrea Quijada. A collection of oral histories called Not a Number, Global Voices from the Automated Welfare State. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why is the moment interesting for political histories of the present, for uses doing things with methods like oral histories. A little bit about me. I'm an associate professor in the political studies department, but I've worn many hats as a researcher, a scholar, and a writer. Most recently, maybe most famously, I wrote a book called Automating Inequality: How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. We'll speak about that briefly in a moment, but I also have done quite a lot of work as a long-form investigative journalist, and actually writing more recently personal essays as well. So I've had a lot of different roles as a writer and as a thinker and a researcher, and that's something that I am excited to talk to you about as I talk about this sort of method that is new to me, which is oral history, and why I chose it for this project. That being said, I also need you. So this is the kind of thing that those of us who have been teaching on Zoom off and on for the last couple of years are used to, this kind of begging, which is rather than you just hearing me talk about my work in sort of a lecture or a broadcast or a delivery style, I'm actually going to break it up a little bit today, and I'm going to ask you some questions. So you don't have to turn on your cameras. You don't have to do anything like that, because I know that Zoom exhaustion is real. But I am going to encourage you to jump in when I have questions. And Kelly's going to help me keep track of people who look particularly eager to talk. So I need you to help. Otherwise, we're going to have a very awkward and boring time. So that's my initial plea. And I'll leave it at that. So I said a little bit about this book, Automating Inequality, and just very briefly, what I do in that book is I tell 3 stories about how new high-tech tools are being integrated into public service programs in the United States. I tell mainly 3 stories in that book. A story about the attempt to automate the eligibility for all the public assistance programs in the state of Indiana in 2006. A new tool that was piloted in Los Angeles County more recently called the Coordinated Entry System, which is a matching algorithm that is supposed to be able to match unhoused people based on a survey of their vulnerability with the most appropriate available housing. And the third story I tell in that book is a story about a tool called the Allegheny Family screening tool, which is used by call center operators in their Child Protective Services office to make decisions about what families will be investigated for child abuse and neglect, and potentially which children might be pulled from their families and put into foster care. So lots to say about that book, but I'm widely available on the internet talking about that book. So if you're really interested in it, feel free to go listen to me talking about those stories elsewhere. What I want to talk about today is some of the things that after this book came out, some of the conversations that I feel like we were not yet having, and how my current project was sort of grounded in wanting to have those conversations. So one of the things that's important about Automating Inequality is it's not actually a scholarly book. It's not with a scholarly press. It's a book of long-form investigative journalism, and it's with a popular press, St. Martin's Press. And that allowed me to capture the voices of lots of people. I did more than 100 interviews for the book. And it allowed me to capture characters and voices in a way that I really thought was important to this larger conversation. Because one of the things that happens when we talk about particularly things like technology and bureaucracy, which can be quite technical and quite boring, is that we lose sight of the human stories behind these kinds of automated tools that I was exploring in the book. And I was lucky that the book actually got out in front of a lot of people. I did more than 100 events behind this book, everywhere from small independent bookstores to like the Jimmy Carter Center in Atlanta to the Aspen Ideas Festival and everything in between. And I was really excited to be part of a group of scholars who brought a conversation about algorithmic decision-making and the ethics of artificial intelligence into the mainstream. So I was really excited to be part of those conversations, and really, really honored to be asked to travel all over the world to talk about the book. But 2 things became really clear as I talked about the book to these sort of international and very mixed audiences. It felt like 2 things were really still missing from the conversation, even as the conversation became more and more popular and more visible. One was, even though I got to share some of the life stories of people who were affected by these tools in automating inequality, I didn't get to share them in any depth. And often I was just sharing these short quotes that illustrated larger sort of concerns, analysis, or themes and patterns that I was uncovering in the book. It felt like there was a lot of room in this larger conversation we were having about technology and governance to really capture the voices of the people who have been directly impacted by these changes. And then the other thing that felt like it was missing to me was any kind of conversation that bridged the experiences of people across national boundaries. So I was really lucky to be asked to go speak about the book in Finland and in Australia and in many other countries around the world. And one of the things that really stood out to me is every place I went, it felt like we were reproducing the same conversation in slightly different ways because of the context. And it felt to me like, man, wouldn't it be like really useful if we had better ways of talking across national boundaries about what our experiences are? Wouldn't we see patterns faster? Wouldn't we be able to share solutions and insights with each other? And so those two concerns, one, that there weren't enough of the voices of people who are directly impacted in the conversation, and two, that there weren't really explicitly global perspectives available, led to this project that I'm working on now, which is a number of things, but among them is a book of collected oral histories that will be, the book we think will be called Not a Number, Global Voices from the Automated Welfare State. I'm doing this work in partnership with my great co-editor, Andrea Quijada from University of New Mexico, and also with our partners, Voice of Witness, which is a nonprofit in the Bay Area of California that is dedicated to facilitating the collection of oral histories, the collection and dissemination of oral histories around human rights abuses in the United States and elsewhere, and also with funding from the Open Society Foundations. Originally, we had a number of goals for this project. We planned to collect 25 oral histories about the digital transformation of the welfare state in 9 countries from 6 regions, so really all around the world. We plan on producing 2 short video documentaries in partnership with Al Jazeera, 4 investigative journalism pieces in partnership with The Guardian, and a book of collected oral histories, that's what I spoke about earlier, that will be published by Haymarket Press. So I want to talk now a little bit about what oral histories are and why we chose this for this particular project. So basically, an oral history is either a method and a sort of a field or a discipline or a kind of analysis that gathers, preserves, interprets the voices, memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. And they are narratives that come from their perspective and are in their words, and that really give primacy to communities that aren't commonly represented in written stories. So oral histories do a number of really, I think, important and interesting things for us. First, though they're not always great about telling us about events themselves, they are amazing at telling us about the meaning of events. They allow communities to write their own history in a way that they don't often have the opportunity to. And oral history provides a very flexible, very self-reflexive, very recursive method where there's a lot of sort of dialogue. I believe, if done well, that oral histories can really meet readers where they're at in terms of providing a kind of narrative structure that helps readers get through what can be very dense and complicated material. But I also want to point out that oral history is incredibly rarely used in political science. And that's one of the sort of questions I want to open for us to talk about today. There on the left side of your screen is just a handful of some of the most famous oral histories. They say in Harlan County, which was an oral history of Appalachia. Svetlana Alekseyevich's The Unwomanly Face of War, which was about experience of Russian women who were involved in World War II. That one won the Pulitzer Prize, so she's doing okay. How We Go Home is a collection of oral histories in the Voice of Witness series from Native American voices in the United States. And Voices of Freedom, an oral history of the civil rights movement, is quite a popular, quite a famous oral history of civil rights workers and others. So the question, one of the questions here then is, why use oral history for something as sort of like current, dynamic, and complex as the digital transformation of the welfare state, and what that means to governance and politics more generally. And I want to just read this short quote from Paul Thompson from his piece, The Voice of the Past Oral History. He says, since the nature of most existing records is to reflect the standpoint of authority, it is not surprising that the judgment of history has has more often than not vindicated the wisdom of the powers that be. Oral history, by contrast, makes a much fairer trial possible. Witnesses can now also be called from the underclasses, the unprivileged, and the defeated. It provides a more realistic and fair reconstruction of the past, a challenge to the established account. History becomes, to put it simply, more democratic. And I'm going to argue in part across our time here together this afternoon that it can also make a more democratic political science possible, particularly about issues that are in rapid flux and are really consequential for people in terms of their daily material lives, and also in terms of the kinds of governance that we get in the future. So I want to return just briefly. Actually, no, let's do this first. So I want to talk a little bit about how you do oral history and how you do it well. And the probably the best way to see how to do oral history well is to listen to sort of one of the great masters of oral history. A guy named Studs Terkel. He grew up in this book here at the left, the book that one of the books that he produced, Working, in I believe 1974, is perhaps the most famous oral history collection in the world. So Terkel grew up in Chicago. His parents ran a 50-room boarding house. He met lots of different kinds of people there at the Wells Grand Hotel. And he said later in his life that the hotel was far more of an education to him than the University of Chicago was. He did graduate with a law degree. He briefly worked for the FBI and then was fired for being Jewish. He found work with the New Deal's Federal Writers Project as a radio performer. He served in the Air Force during World War II. After that, he got a job creating radio programs for NBC Radio, but he was blacklisted because he had fundraised for the Soviet American Friendship Committee and the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee. So it wasn't until he was 40 in 1952 that he finally found a pretty permanent home in terms of his working life. And that was with the Chicago radio station WFMT, where he produced a daily 1-hour radio show, originally called Sounds of the City and then called the Studs Terkel Program. And he produced that show for 45 years every day. So he produced an estimated 7,000 shows over his career. And it wasn't until he was 55 that he really started writing in earnest. So when he was 55, he produced a book of oral histories called Division Street America about Chicago that came out in 1967. Later, he produced Working, which has like a most wonderful and super awkward subtitle. People talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. That came out in 1974. It was followed by his book of oral histories about World War II, The Good War, which he won a Pulitzer Prize for in '84. And then another one of his very well-known books, Race, What Blacks and Whites Think About the American Obsession, which came out in 1992. So Studs Terkel basically spent his whole career talking to strangers, asking questions, listening deeply, and writing about it. And he did that until he died in 2008 at the age of 96. And I want to say he's really very good. He's very good at asking people about their lives and listening. So what I want to do is I want us to listen to just a very brief little clip from the tapes of one of his interviews for the book Working. And while you listen, I want you to think about a couple of questions. And when we get back, we'll talk about them briefly. So first, I want you to think a little bit about like, how did he get people to talk about themselves the way they talk about themselves in this clip? Second, why do you think he was doing what he was doing? Why did he even ask these questions? Why did he ask people about working in 1970? And then finally, what did he get when he asked these questions? Okay, that makes sense? So this is not Zoom perfect, because I'm going to have to escape out of this for a second to get us to the tape. But you can stare at my presenter view for 5 minutes while I play this short clip.
In our first story, Studs interviews a telephone switchboard operator in Waukegan, Illinois.
I'm talking to Sharon Griggins. You're about 17 going 18.
Mm-hmm.
And you work for Illinois Bell.
Oh, yes. Ma Bell. See, when you dial the operator, that's what you get. You get someone like me. When you dial O.
Oh, when they dial O,
Mhm.
we get you.
That's it. Because this is the only telephone office in Waukegan.
Could you describe it?
So it's a big, long room, about half the size of a gymnasium, I would say. And it's down both sides, there's a whole row of switchboards.
How close is the girl sitting next to you?
Oh, very close. I would say she'd be sitting not even 5 or 6 inches away from me.
Is that cramped?
Yeah, we're cramped.
So now describe it step by step, as though you were
Okay.
telling a little child what it is.
Okay, now, first of all, in front of you, you've got about 7 pairs of cords and all these lights that tell you where the calls are coming from. When a light goes on, it means there's someone waiting there, and you plug in and you ask them what they want.
Do your arms get tired?
No, your mouth gets tired. It's the strangest. You get tired of talking. You've been talking for so long because you talk constantly for 6 hours, and it's hard.
Keep going in this one.
Well, you get to feel just like a machine because essentially you're on this level of about 7 or 8 phrases that you use.
Like what?
You say, good morning, may I help you? Operator, may I help you? Oh, then it's what number did you want? Or I have a collect call for you from so and so. Will you accept the charge? Something like that.
You said it's pretty hard.
It is because what you're doing is like monotonous work. But for me, it's a great temptation to talk. Like when I'm bored, I make some little comments or something, or I talk with a Southern accent or a Puerto Rican accent. Or you try and make your voice really sexy and just see what kind of reaction.
Your voice are in.
Yeah, I do. But if you get caught talking with the customer, that's one mark against you.
Because the company says you can't get too personal.
Yeah, you can't. You know, some people, they'll say, operator, I'm lonesome. Will you talk to me?
People do say that? Really?
They say, I'm lonesome. Will you talk to me?
What
And you couldn't. I says, gee, I'm sorry. I really can't. But you can't.
You're doing a great deal of talking, but the talk has nothing to do with actual human communication.
Right. That's very true. It's not really a lonely profession or anything, but it's one where you not a whole lot of communication, even though that is your job.
Sharon, you're quite marvelous. Really. Do you see yourself as a telephone operator for the rest of your life?
No, never.
I did not become a career telephone operator. My name is Sharon Griggins. Back in 1972, I was a telephone operator in Studs Terkel's working. You know, I really remember working there very vividly. And I don't know, maybe that job helped me develop a keener ear for what people need and what people want. I think I became a really good listener. But let's get real. I don't think there's much romance in the work of a telephone operator. I think about some poor person at the end of that line who's sitting in a cubicle somewhere, saying the same things, taking down the same numbers for 8 hours a day. You know, automation is great in today's world, but it's hard to automate everybody's wishes and wants. I mean, we've all had those situations where all you want to do is talk to somebody and all you have is a list of menu options. You know, I still tell my kids, just always pick 0.
You feel a machine did replace you one day soon?
Oh, sure.
Hmm?
Sure. It'd have to be some machine, though, because the people knew how funnily they talked, how badly they pronunciate, how hard it is to understand some people. A machine would have a hard time.
Telephone switchboard operator Sharon Griggins, interviewed by Studs Terkel.
All right. I'm going to let you see my slides again. Oh, there we go. Wrong slide, but you're seeing my slides, right? So let's start, and this is where this is where my plea is coming in for you guys to sort of jump in here a little bit. And since we have such limited time, I'm just going to ask you to just unmute and jump in if you want to. If we get talking over each other a lot, then we'll find a way to deal with that. But I want to start by just asking this question of like, how did he encourage people to talk about themselves? What was he actually doing? Does anyone want to take that one on? What stood out to you?
I'll jump in and say he didn't condescend. He met people where they were.
Oh, that's so interesting, Michael. Thank you for that. Can you give an example?
He didn't ask them why they weren't doing something else. He didn't ask about how they wound up there. Do you want something better or different? He found people where they were and validated them there.
Huh, yeah, that's a really good point, Michael. Thank you. Julie, were you trying to jump in?
Yeah, it was really striking the way that he just kept eliciting more details. The questions really invited people to give a lot of depth to their descriptions of what was going on.
Yeah, and he's getting these like really rich sensory details. He's like very focused on like what the space is like, where your body is, right? How do you feel, right? And that stuff, when you read the book, when you read Working, it really comes across, and like the narratives are actually super engrossing because you get a sense of like, she's sitting in this half gymnasium sized room where she's literally this far away from the person next to her, just in rows, like, and it gives you so much a sense of what that job is like. Yeah. So like, there's more to say about that, but since we're short on time, I'm going to ask, like, why do you think he did it this way? And this comes back, I think, Michael, to your sort of point here too, about like how you interact with people when you're doing this work. He has a purpose to interacting with people the way he is. So why do you think he did it this way, rather than kind of what we're normally used to in interviews, which is almost like antagonistic sometimes?
Well, since I said it, I'll add that there's something very humanist about it, and I feel that he's driven by a love for the people that he's interacting with and an affection. And it's correct, in celebrity interviews or politicians or in government or this, or as an attorney, when you're trying to elicit information to build a record or build a case, it is antagonistic, and you're trying to get something that people don't want to share. And in this case, he's speaking with people about things they want to talk about.
Yeah, and I always feel like when I listen to him work, which is like just probably like for me, the masterclass in interviewing is just like listening to Studs Terkel tapes all day. One of the things that really impresses on me is like, he is genuinely curious, right? He really wants to know like what it's like to talk on the telephone for Ma Bell all day. Like he's really genuinely, and if he's not genuinely interested in that, he's faking it really well. And it allows him to do things like later on, you didn't hear this in the tape, but later on with another one of the interviewees from Working, he asked these really difficult questions. So one of the questions he asked of, I think, everybody in the book Working was, do you feel like you've done meaningful work with your life? And by the time he asks that question, people are like really honest and go to really deep places with him, because they can tell that he's genuinely curious about them. And people are smart, right? People know what your motives are when you're asking them about their lives. And so that's something that I really, really admire about him as an oral historian. And then finally, what did he get out of this way of doing things? And one of the things I want to suggest is that he got much, much more than just a story about, the very long and awkward subtitle of the book. People talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. He gets to a lot more things than just work, right? So even in just this like 3-minute clip from his interview with a 17-year-old telephone operator, they're talking already in 1970 about the role automation is going to play in this profession. They're talking about gendered expectations of work. Pretty quickly after this, they talk about like unions and other ways that labor protects itself and how that's changing. Remember, this is the early 1970s, right? So he ends up really capturing this beautiful political portrait of the country just by asking people what they do all day. And there's something that I think is really, really extraordinary about that. The other thing that stands out for me is that one of the great things about this radio show, and I'll give you the link to it at the end of the conversation today, but one of the great things about this particular radio show is that they went back and found many of the narrators from his original books, and then they talked to them about how they felt about the process of being in the book. And one of the things that really, really stands out to me is all the people who they found and who agreed to talk to them, they sound like this experience of talking to Studs Terkel for like an hour one afternoon in 1972 was like a profound transformative experience for them. So Sheila Lum, the telephone operator, goes on to be a communications professional, right? And I'm not sure that's unrelated to the hour she spent with Studs Terkel, like talking about her work in communication and talking about her life. So when it's done really well, one of the amazing things about oral history is it is this way of addressing big questions in the world through the like small and daily actions of ordinary people. And there's something that to me is so moving and so incredibly productive about that, which is why we decided to do oral history of something that is still going on today. So in this weird way, we're doing a collection that is an oral history of the present, which is quite similar to Studs Terkel, actually. He's not, except for in his World War II book, he tends to be talking about things that are happening in the moment through this method of that is most used by historians. So I just want to tell you a little bit about this project, and then I'm going to play you a very short clip of one of our interviews for this project, and then we'll get to questions. So again, the project is called Not a Number, Global Voices from the Automated Welfare State. I'm doing a partnership with my dear colleague and friend, Andrea Quijada. The goal is to gather 24 cradle to now stories, meaning that we're talking about this specific topic of the digital transformation of the welfare state, but we're talking about it in the context of people's whole lives. So we ask about people, like what toys they played with when they were children. We ask about like what they had for breakfast yesterday. So we ask about the whole span of their lives. We are intending to gather at least 24 of these cradle to now oral histories from 12 countries around the world. The topic that we're shaping the collection around is this the transformation, the digital transformation of the welfare state. So again, it's very much a history of the present. They were narrating things that are happening in the moment. And it's narrated and will be published in the words of the people who are most directly impacted by these changes. So Andrea and I won't necessarily show up at all in these interviews. So they'll be edited to be narratives from the narrators' voices. So I want to say that I know that I am not Studs Terkel. I'm not nearly as good at this as he is, but I want you to kind of get a sense of what these stories sound like. So I'm going to play a very brief, it's like maybe a little bit more than 6 minute clip from one of the interviews I did. This is from is audio from Hayden Patterson from Adelaide in South Australia. When I was speaking to him, he was at the time he was unhoused. We were talking over Zoom while he was in a park where we was spending most of his days. So the audio quality is not terrific, but I want you to hear him reflect on his own experience.
Why don't you start by telling me what robo-debt is?
So it was an algorithm that the government came up with that they knew was going to mismatch data, but it matched data up against the tax office and Centrelink and all the other services that go through government systems. And the onus was on people to prove they didn't owe the money, and if they couldn't, they would then have to pay it back. But they were also chased with the same ferocity as debt collectors.
Yeah.
And so people were bullied into repayment arrangements, and for the most part, people were paying these for many years. Then we started to find out that there were a lot of mental health trauma and family breakups, people becoming homeless because they were and also people were actually killing themselves over this as well. I've spoken to several people who ultimately ended up taking their lives. And for the most part, when I spoke to them, they knew they didn't owe any money, but how do you take on the government? So you just have to agree and you have to pay. And if you don't agree and you don't pay, it gets garnished off of your income anyway. So, you know, ultimately they're going to get their money. This has been going on for probably about 5 years. And there were, you know, people were generating $20,000, $30,000 debts, sometimes from 10, 12 years ago. And as I say, if you couldn't substantiate they didn't actually owe the money, we started a class action. And ultimately that went through the courts, and the government's robo-debt scheme was deemed to be illegal. And then they changed the algorithm a little bit, and then ultimately that was taken to court, and they were told that the whole thing was illegal and they had to refund people's monies that they'd already paid. The problem is, just like they got them in installments, they're paying them back in installments. So some people will be waiting 8 to 10 years to get their money back, and you know it's almost just common buzz around the place that the government hopes you'll die before they end up having to pay it back. They're paying no interest on it. It's unlike any other money that you would have paid that you've been not to have been liable for.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty interesting, shitty situation. But yeah, the only way that it was actually taken on was with that class action.
So
the government stood there the whole way through.
yeah. So I think I can fill in the details of the robo-debt system, and I'll run that language by you so make sure you're comfortable with it. But sort of two things that only you can provide. One is, you know, I think it's rare that we have successes against these things. And so, like, how did that victory feel? And what did it mean to, like, you, to the people you care about?
Look, there was absolute elation around the country. You know, there's still that sadness that it came too late, and there was so much longer than it actually had to take, and far too many lives were lost.
Yeah.
And it's such a waste. And why are these people's lives lost? Is it because they're worth less than anyone else? There's several issues, like Work for the Dole is another one, where people have died. They're not covered with the same protections as everyone else. And it's kind of like slave labor.
Yeah.
Then you've got cashless welfare. Then you've got all of the other issues that come along with income support. So it's a big victory, but it feels like we're just starting down the road that we need to do to get all of those other things addressed as well. Yeah.
So then the other thing that it feels like only you can offer is just like, is there like an image or a person story or like an event that for you just like captures robo-debt in like a nutshell, in like what's going to stick with you forever? Like, what's the thing that happened that you're like, I will never forget that?
The first thing that always comes to mind is that 24-year-old kid that I spoke to just before Christmas about 3 years ago. And, you know, they call the union for advice all the time. And he knew, we spoke so openly about it, that he didn't owe any money. He was engaged. He had his whole life ahead of him. And yet just before Christmas, he took his own life because he just couldn't handle this stuff. I'm so traumatized by that. And the 16 other suicides that I'm intimately a part of during my time at the union that I'm never going to get over it. And the sad thing is that it didn't even happen to me. Like,
Yeah.
these are people with families that will never get over it. And, you know, people who, children that are going to grow up without their parents, and parents that are not going to see their kids grow up bringing up those children. You know, it's so heartbreaking. And it's not so much the robo-debt or whatever it is. It's just, how do you take on a government that's just not listening to you?
All right, there's some really beautiful things that happen just like in the next 2 minutes of that tape, but I realize that we're running short on time, so I'm gonna stop Hayden there for now. And also I'm gonna I think make a call of us not going through these questions one by one, but maybe bringing them up at the end in the sort of open Q&A that we can use this as ways to get started. I just want to reflect on a couple of things that I think are important about that clip. One is that one of the things that's amazing about Hayden's narrative is that because he's been involved with public services in Australia since he was a child, he has this sort of amazing perspective on these changes. He also worked for a long time for the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, and so he obviously has a very specific framework that he's understanding these changes in. He has this sort of perspective as an organizer and as someone who is sort of stood by people who have been struggling with benefit cuts for a long time. And I also just want to say that as brilliant and articulate as Hayden is, he is not at all the exception. So far we've collected 18 oral histories in 5 countries. So we're getting close to our goals. And we've collected oral histories from just as wildly different people as a woman in Helsinki who started working in homeless services after coming out of prison, and has become a sort of fierce advocate for unhoused people in Helsinki. To a man who makes his living scrap picking in Madrid in Spain, and struggled with the ingreso minimum, vital, the basic minimum income that was passed during COVID in Spain. A woman in Colombia who runs an unlicensed animal shelter out of her house, and because it's unlicensed, continually gets sort of categorized by a system there called the CISPEN, which decides what kind of access to public resources you get. So really people from all kinds of different positions in life, all kinds of different things from all sorts of different places. And the one thing I can say for sure about all of them is they all sound exactly that smart in the interviews, right? They have incredible depth of understanding and analysis of their own situation. And it's one of the things that has been really amazing about this project, because so often when I talk to people about writing about technology and bureaucracy, either whether journalists or other academics, generally the first question people ask me when I talk about like method is like, oh, well, how do you find good sources? Because most people just don't understand this stuff well enough to say anything smart about it. And it really has not been my experience at all. I find the folks I speak to about these things are incredibly smart about them, really insightful, often ahead of the curve of where academics and media and even me are in thinking about it, because of course they're having to deal with the day-to-day impacts of these tools in their lives. And they of course think deeply about that because the impacts are so materially important, like whether people get access to food, healthcare, housing, their children, other really important things like that. So just very briefly before we open it up for bigger questions, I just want to say there was a number of things that were really unexpected about this project that I'm also happy to talk about. So I'll just open the topics for conversation if you want to talk about them. One, of course, is COVID. So we got the funding for this project in like November of 2019. And the plan was to travel ourselves to 12 different countries in 2 years. Clearly that did not happen. And we had to rethink the structure of what we were doing, the process of how we were doing it, and the kinds of stories we were collecting and how we were going to collect them. We had to think through all of that stuff and make some really big changes, many of which worked out, I think, to be better than they would have been. Also, I think a lot about making space for people's trauma and for healing in these conversations. I feel like that's a really big responsibility that Andrea and I carry as editors, is recognizing that some of these experiences are incredibly difficult for people, and that the work that Andrea and I are doing is, as Andrea would say, the work we're doing is important but not urgent, and certainly not worth creating more harm in the process of collecting and sharing these stories. There have been real challenges around this being a global project, including the particular difficulties of capturing people's voice when you're working in a language that is not your own, and often you're working in more than one language. So for example, one of the interviews we did in Finland was someone who was speaking Iraqi Arabic to a Finnish translator, then to somebody who was translating from Finnish to English so I could understand it, and then back up the chain. So those kinds of issues have been really interesting. And finally, Andrea and I have thought a lot about what it means to bring the narratives home, meaning that we see that the primary product of this project is a collection of oral histories from all over the world that, unless we find another publishing partner and a lot of money, will likely only be available in English in the United States. And for us, that did not feel like an ethical way to treat these stories. And so one of the things that we've thought and talked a lot about since is like, what does it mean to bring the stories home in their home language, in ways that can be used by people besides us in the work of addressing algorithmic harms, and also in the work of sort of building community around these issues. And then finally, if we want to talk about it, I also want to come back to this question that I started things with a little bit, which is like, why would you want to use oral history in political science? Like, why create political histories of the present? But for now, what I want to do is open it up, because I see that we're quite close to time, and I want to make sure we have some time for conversation. So Julie, this is up to you. Would you like to ask like a bridging question, or do you want to just sort of open things up? I'm going to let you make that decision as our moderator.
Well, we're very short on time, so I think I'd prefer just to open things up. We could start with the question that Brian Greenhill placed in the chat, which I'm curious about too.
I'm not seeing it right now. Could you share the question?
Certainly. Brian writes, can you tell us more about how you find people to interview? How easy or difficult is it to get people to feel comfortable sharing their stories?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's such a great question. It is a lot. It's not easy. It's very time intensive. One of the changes around COVID that has been really useful is that originally we had planned to work in collaboration with local folks. So right in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're working with the journalist word for it is a fixer, but a fixer who is Maori, because one of the stories we're collecting is Maori, and really important to have someone there who's doing a little bit of cultural preparation and cultural translation work for us. Because of COVID, we've ended up relying way more on those local partners because we have not been traveling as much as we thought. So the process of finding people has usually started with the process of finding a fixer in that country. talking with them about what the sort of issues are, and then thinking through what kinds of stories might be interesting, and then working through that fixers networks to find people who might be interested in speaking with us. Sort of from there, it goes to also a complex process of them getting to know me or getting to know Andrea and making decisions about whether they want to be involved in our work. Because it is really clear that this is going to be really time intensive, right? Generally, I do about 4 interviews, about 3 hours each. And then we remain in contact with narrators over months and even years, because then once we start to edit those transcripts into narratives, we also have to go back. We not have to. We want to go back and forth with the narrators to make sure our edits capture what they think that the narrative is, and that we capture their voice and that they feel comfortable with it, because there's quite a lot of editing that has to happen as well. So we have these very long-term relationships with narrators, including into the publication process, right? So we hope to involve them in sort of an advisory board around what's going to happen with the book and what's going to happen with media around the book. And also hope to sort of include them in this process of bringing stories home as well. So yeah, it's a very long-term relationship, and there's a lot of checks and balances in it. In that at any point they absolutely, it's very clear that they can withdraw at any point, that it's their story, so they're in charge of their story. But yeah, it's a lot. It has taken a lot more time and a lot more effort than even we sort of originally imagined. They're very intense relationships.
Great, thanks. We have another question that actually came in earlier, which is, what recommendations do you have for maintaining the privacy of individuals you're interviewing or collecting oral histories from? Yeah. This person says, well, I don't expect you to address this directly. I'm thinking a lot about these days in relation to how interviews, histories, and academics are being targeted by legislation and in social media in ways that could potentially harm your participants.
Yeah. So this is something I talk a lot about in, sometimes I am lucky enough to teach the methods class, the qualitative methods class for our department. And I think a lot about research ethics of qualitative research. And one of the things I tend to push students on is that ethics is a process that goes beyond privacy. I want to be really clear that I think privacy, for people who want privacy, it is really important to honor that. I will also say that the clip you heard from my research is Hayden Patterson. That's his real name. He lives in Adelaide. He and I talked about it. You know, we talked about what the clip was going to be. We talked about how I was going to talk about it. And he actually very much wanted to be referenced by name. And so for me, like, ethical responsibility and ethical relationship with people that you're doing research with, privacy can sometimes, or anonymity can sometimes be a crutch, right? Because if we can get you to sign that IRB form, and if we don't use your real name, then we can do whatever we want with the material, right? Like after we've had our interview and we maybe send you the transcripts to okay. And my experience with oral history and also with journalism is that having a relationship of ongoing consent, right? Where there is no one and done, where there is no hiding, if people don't want their identities hidden, that you don't hide people's identities. In fact, you use their real name or ask them to go on record for journalism. Where that, for me, I was, you know, this is just, I'm just speaking for myself, but for me, it felt like it upped the ethical stakes on me, which is like, I'm going to be in relationship with this person for years. Like, and how do I make sure that the research is true and valid and rigorous? And also, I am having an ethical relationship with the people who are involved in my work. For me, I found that sometimes I went to anonymity when I was avoiding having a difficult conversation with a source that I didn't want to have. So actually anonymity was protecting me and not protecting them. And so I work really hard at this idea of having ongoing consent, which means I am just constantly in communication with people. I'm checking in with people. And that works really well for something like an oral history, which is about their voice and their story. It works a little less well for journalism, where sometimes people say things that they've said and that you're going to be like, I'm not giving you a chance to change your mind because now you've talked to your PR guy, like this is what you said. So the sort of ethical struggle I had around journalism was more about being okay with being the bad guy, with like sources not liking me. That was a whole different set of interesting ethical issues. But one, of course, privacy is important if people want to be anonymous, and we let people in this book be anonymous, and then we talk in the oral histories be anonymous, and then we talk at great length about how to hide their identity. We put them in a slightly different place in the country. We move their timelines around a little bit, but we also say that we've done that. So we're really careful about protecting anonymity if that's what people want. But we have these very ongoing conversations throughout the process about whether that's what they want or whether they want to use their real name. It's a great question. It's an important one.
Great. Desiree Wabel asks, do the providers of or the decision makers for the automated systems that you're studying, that your interviewees are impacted by, come into view as well?
In this collection?
Yes.
With a very intentional decision, no. And part of that is sort of like the difference between neutrality and objectivity. So I think we've been very objective in this book, but maybe not very neutral. Meaning like we're not doing both and-ism, be like, well, this group of people say this, and this other group of people with very different interests say exactly the opposite. And the only way we can be fair is to give you both sides. We're not giving both sides. The reason we're not giving both sides, we're giving very deep, complex stories of people who are directly impacted. But the reason we don't have like 12 impacted people and 12 administrators is because every other thing published about this is from the perspective of administrators. So in order to be truly balanced, we actually think that this group of stories has to just be impacted people. There's one potential exception to that, which is we want to talk about, there's a specific concept called indigenous data sovereignty. And we may ask an expert to do a brief interview about what that is and put it in like a sidebar around this, within this Maori narrative that we're working on, because we think that concept is so important. And we want people, particularly with a global collection, it's sometimes hard to have the contextual framework to understand what people are talking about. So that's one place where we might call in an academic expert. But otherwise, no, the narrators are all quite poor or working class folks who have had very direct experiences of the impacts of these systems. Not necessarily the negative impacts, but the impacts of these systems. Those are the only people we're talking to for this project.
So we are almost out of time, but I'm going to invite you to wrap up by actually turning around a question that you asked us to think about and asking it back to you, which is, what do you think the value added is for this kind of work in terms of understanding politics, political dynamics, the contribution to political science?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for raising that question again. Oops, I just messed up the slides because I have a note on this somewhere. Let me see where my note is. So I feel like one of the things that I started to do when I started to think, is oral history kind of the right way to go after this project, is that I started to look, no, I'll do it extemporaneously because those notes are missing. I started to look at how oral history had been used in political science in the past. And I was quite surprised to see that it largely hadn't been, except for in a few instances, which were mostly talking to like very elite people in politics. So oral histories of a presidency, for example, from the point of view of the president or from the point of view of the chief of staff. And one of the things that I find really interesting and important or really puzzling about political science is that we tend to be more prescriptive than descriptive. And we tend to be better at the big picture of groups, so like behavior, and not quite so good at the small picture of like, how do people interpret their own experience? And then for me, to see the field struggle around things like the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the election of Trump, right, the January 6th insurrection, you know, and other sort of like big events that have happened in the last couple of years, it feels like we could do a better job. It's like understanding what people think about their own political experience. And so to me, the only way we can get to that is by asking people. And that's why the title of the talk today, why not ask? It doesn't mean we're then getting like a factually impeachable record of the present, but it does mean we understand a lot better what people's motivations are, how people are interpreting their own experience, and even what they might do in the future. So even for predictive political science, I think like asking people what their experience is could be like a great benefit to the field. And I'd love to see us do more of that. And part of what I hope to do with this project is try to start that conversation a little bit about why there's this amazing tool out there that we largely just don't use at all. So yeah, I hope that becomes part of the conversation. Before we get done, I just want to give you these quick resources. If you want to know more about my last book, Automating Inequality, that's where you can find it. I highly recommend listening to the Studs Terkel Radio Archive. It's super amazing. There's some information about where to find the Voice of Witness oral history series, and also where to find more information about our project.
Thank you. I put a couple of other resources in the chat as well. I think I speak for everyone in expressing my gratitude for this wonderful and informative session. What a great way to wrap up this semester's run of masterclasses. So thank you so much to you, Virginia, for being with us. Thank you so much to Kelly and Renee for organizing this series, which has been wonderful. And thank you all to everybody who has been to one or more of these fantastic talks. We're very glad to have you engaged with us. And because you're here, you know, we'll make sure that we can provide some more for you going forward. So thank you, everyone. And I hope that the rest of your week and the rest of your year go well.